When you think of Leviticus, it's easy to get bogged down in all the rules and regulations. But in chapter 17, there's some really interesting stuff about sacrifice and how the ancient Israelites viewed life itself. So let's dive right in. We're working with the King James Version, and you've also brought in some commentary from Matthew Henry that goes all the way back to 1710. I'm excited to see what kind of perspective that adds to our deep dive.
It definitely adds a rich layer, that's for sure. It's amazing to see how these ancient texts can still resonate with us centuries later.
Absolutely. So Leviticus 17 kicks off with some very specific instructions about animal sacrifices. It says that all Israelites, no matter what, had to bring their sacrifices to the tabernacle. No exceptions. Inside the camp, outside the camp, ox, sheep, it all had to be presented at the tabernacle.
And what's fascinating is that it wasn't just about the physical location. Bringing those sacrifices to the tabernacle was a powerful symbol of their covenant with God. The tabernacle was like the center of their religious life, the place where heaven and earth met.
It was where the priests performed those rituals that allowed for atonement and maintained that connection between the people and God, right?
Exactly. It was a tangible representation of their relationship with the divine.
So bringing your offering to the tabernacle was a way of acknowledging that everything ultimately belonged to God.
Precisely. And it wasn't just a suggestion or a nice gesture. The text is very clear. Anyone who disobeyed this command would be cut off from their people.
Wow, just imagine being exiled from your entire community, your whole social structure, just for breaking a religious rule. Talk about high stakes. It really shows how seriously they took this covenant with God. But what did cut off actually mean? Was it a literal exile or more of a spiritual separation?
It's a great question. And the meaning of cut off is open to interpretation. Some scholars think it meant being physically banished, like sent away from the community, but others believe it refers more to a spiritual separation from God, essentially breaking that covenant we were talking about.
Either way, it doesn't sound like a fun consequence. Okay, so we've got the tabernacle as this central point of worship, and there are serious consequences for not bringing your sacrifices there. But then there's another rule in Leviticus 17 that really caught my eye, the prohibition against offering sacrifices to devils. What's the story there?
Yes. That's where the historical context gets really interesting. Remember, the Israelites were surrounded by other cultures, each with their own gods and religious practices.
So it's likely that even while they were trying to follow the one true God, there were temptations to mix things up, maybe dabble in other beliefs, or even blend those pagan practices into their own worship.
Exactly. It was a constant challenge to maintain that purity of faith.
So this verse is like a firm reminder to stick to the plan, right?
Mm,
No mixing and matching with other deities.
precisely. It underscores the importance of remaining devoted to one God and avoiding idolatry, which was a constant struggle for the Israelites throughout their history.
It makes you wonder who or what were these devils that were tempting the Israelites? Were they specific gods from other religions or just a more general representation of evil forces?
It's a great question, and there's no easy answer. Some scholars believe devils refer to specific pagan deities that the Israelites might have been tempted to worship, but others think it's more of a broader term for anything that could pull them away from their covenant with God.
Okay, so sacrifices are for God, no devils allowed. Got it. But then Leviticus 17 takes another intense turn with the rules about blood. And that phrase, cut off, pops up again.
The language around blood is really striking, isn't it? It emphasizes how serious this prohibition was. You couldn't just casually eat blood. And it wasn't just about food either. Even when they hunted animals, they had a specific ritual of pouring out the blood and covering it with dust.
Why all the fuss about blood? It's not like it's the only part of the animal that's, well, a little intense to think about eating. What
Yeah.
made it so different?
It comes down to this core belief that's repeated several times in Leviticus 17. The life of the flesh is in the blood. The Israelites saw blood as something sacred. It represented the very essence of life itself.
So blood wasn't just a physical substance. It held a much deeper symbolic meaning.
Exactly. And because blood was so closely linked with life, it couldn't be taken lightly or consumed casually. It was reserved for a higher purpose atonement. The blood of a sacrificed animal symbolized the giving of that life back to God, a way to atone for wrongdoing.
Now, it's pretty amazing to think how this concept of blood and atonement connects to later Christian beliefs.
That's a really insightful connection. The idea that life is in the blood and that blood can be a sacrifice for sins definitely resonates with the Christian understanding of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. His blood in Christian theology becomes the ultimate offering, atoning for the sins of humanity.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful link between these ancient Israelite practices and what would become a cornerstone of Christian theology. But let's circle back to that ritual of pouring out the blood and covering it with dust, even when it was from a hunted animal, not a sacrifice. It seems like they were treating even those animals with a certain reverence.
Absolutely. It wasn't enough to just avoid consuming the blood. The act of pouring it out and covering it with dust symbolized the returning of that life force, represented by the blood, back to God.
It's like acknowledging that even in taking a life for food, there's a deep respect for the life that's been taken, and awareness of its sacredness.
Exactly. A recognition that all life ultimately comes from God. And it's fascinating to see how these seemingly simple rituals are packed with so much meaning. But let's bring in Matthew Henry's commentary now. He offered some really thought-provoking interpretations of Leviticus 17, especially when it comes to this idea of
He's
sacrifice.
writing back in 1710, and I'm really interested to hear what he had to say.
Well, Henry was particularly fascinated by this shift from physical sacrifices to more spiritual ones. He saw the laws in Leviticus, especially those concerning blood and sacrifice, as foreshadowing the ultimate sacrifice of Christ.
So he saw those detailed instructions in Leviticus as pointing towards something greater, something that would be fulfilled in the future.
Precisely. He even called Christ the true tabernacle, suggesting that Christ himself became the embodiment of that sacred space where humanity could connect with God.
So, for Henry, Christ becomes the ultimate altar, and his blood becomes the ultimate sacrifice, making the old system of animal sacrifices unnecessary.
That's a great summary of Henry's perspective. He believed that with Christ's arrival, the true spiritual meaning behind these ancient laws and rituals was fulfilled. The focus for Christians shifts from outward rituals to inward transformation, from physical sacrifices to a heart and spirit united with God through Christ.
And that raises a really interesting point about how Henry viewed unity. He argued that true Christian unity didn't depend on a specific location or set of physical rituals.
It's about that inner connection with God and with fellow believers, a spiritual unity that goes beyond any physical boundaries.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone from the specific rules about sacrifices and blood in ancient Israel to these broader theological ideas explored by Matthew Henry centuries later. It's incredible how these ancient texts can spark such fascinating and relevant discussions even today.
It really is. It speaks to the enduring power of these texts and the questions they raise about our relationship with the divine, with each other, and with life itself. And, it really makes you think, do we have anything like that in our modern world? Something that might seem strange to outsiders, but is super important to our own sense of identity and morality.
That's such a great point. It's easy to judge other cultures or time periods without realizing that we might have our own versions of those same things.
It's true. We may not have tabernacles and animal sacrifices today, but we still have those rituals and symbols that hold deep meaning for us.
Totally. Like, think about the way people react when their country's flag is disrespected, or how certain foods or religious practices can be so deeply personal for some people.
Exactly. It's like those things become sacred because they represent something much bigger than themselves.
Yeah, and I think it shows how those ideas from Leviticus about the power of symbols and respecting what's sacred, well, they're still relevant today, even if the specifics have changed over time.
Right. And speaking of things changing over time, it's fascinating to see how those ancient ideas about blood and sacrifice evolved in later Jewish and Christian traditions.
Like the connection between those rituals in Leviticus and the Christian understanding of Christ's sacrifice, it's pretty mind-blowing.
It really is. It shows how religious thought is always developing and changing and being reinterpreted in new ways.
And it makes you realize how rich the Bible is. It's not just a static book of rules, It's a living text that has spoken to people differently for thousands of years.
It's more like an ongoing conversation, a dialogue across the centuries, with each generation bringing its own understanding to the table.
I love that. And thinking about Matthew Henry's commentary, he was writing in the 18th century, but his insights still feel so relevant today.
Henry was amazing at bridging the gap between the ancient world and his own time. One thing he did so well was connect those Old Testament rituals to a more spiritual understanding of sacrifice.
Oh, you mean his idea that Christ becomes the ultimate sacrifice, the true tabernacle, that Christ fulfilled those ancient laws in a new way?
Exactly. Henry saw Christ as the ultimate fulfillment of all those sacrifices in Leviticus. And with Christ, the focus shifts. It's no longer about what you do, but about an inward transformation of the heart.
So it's more about a genuine connection with God than about following a set of rules.
Precisely, and that's a message that resonates with people even today, whether they consider themselves Christian or not. We all want to know what our purpose is, and we all want to feel connected to something bigger than ourselves.
Absolutely. And Henry also had some interesting thoughts about unity. He argued that true Christian unity wasn't about a physical place or performing specific rituals.
It's about that shared faith, that inner connection you feel with God and with others who share your beliefs. It goes beyond any physical boundaries.
It's a powerful message, especially today when it feels like there's so much division in the world. It's a reminder that we can still connect with each other and find common ground, even if we have our differences.
It all goes back to that spiritual connection, and even Leviticus, in a way, hints at that. Remember how the Israelites were commanded to bring their sacrifices to the tabernacle? It was that central point where they could connect with God.
It was like a physical representation of them coming together as a community, being part of something bigger than themselves.
Yes, and Henry's interpretation takes it even further. He suggests that true unity isn't limited to a specific place or time. It's something we carry within us, that spiritual bond that connects us even when we're apart.
That's such a beautiful idea. And it brings us back to what we've been talking about, how these ancient texts can speak to us today, giving us insights into our own lives and how we find meaning.
And how even a text that seems so ancient and rule-focused, like Leviticus, can still be relevant to our modern world.
So as we start wrapping up our deep dive into Leviticus 17, what would you say is the most important takeaway?
I think it's that even a book like Leviticus, which seems so focused on rules, can offer us deep insights into human nature and how we relate to the divine.
It's about digging deeper and finding those timeless truths that have resonated with people for centuries.
And recognizing that these ancient stories and rituals can still guide and inspire us on our own spiritual journeys.
Well said. And to our listener, don't be afraid to engage with these texts, to ask your own questions, and to find what resonates with you.
That's what makes these deep dives so rewarding. It's not about just listening passively. It's about actively exploring these ideas and challenging ourselves to think in new ways.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Leviticus 17, I'd love to leave our listener with a final thought, a question to ponder. What do you think?
How about this? We've talked about how the ancient Israelites viewed sacrifice, the importance of life, and their relationship with God. But how do these concepts speak to you personally today? How do your own experiences and beliefs shape how you understand these universal themes?
This is a fantastic question. It encourages our listeners to connect those ancient ideas to their own lives and experiences, to find their own meaning in them. It's like we've been given this ancient map, and it's leading us to all sorts of new discoveries.
And there are so many paths to explore. Leviticus 17 is just one chapter, one small piece of a much bigger story.
It reminds us that we're always learning, always discovering new things.
Exactly. And that's what's so amazing about these ancient texts. They're not just relics of the past. They still have so much to teach us.
Well, this has been a fantastic journey through Leviticus 17. Thanks so much for sharing your insights.
It's always a pleasure to explore these fascinating topics. Until next time.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned something new and maybe even feel inspired to do some exploring of your own.